and a grant technical assistance manager at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. And we are doing this webinar in partnership with the National Resource Center on Justice-Involved Women. It's funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. So thank you for joining the Trauma-Informed Care and Mental Health Courts webinar. So as a slight reminder of the WebEx software, at the bottom right corner you'll see a question and answer box, and if you have any questions for any of the presenters as we go along, you can chat into that box and we'll save the questions and provide those at the end, and we'll also open all the lines so any of the mental health court curriculum trainers can just ask questions. So if you want us to keep track of it, you can chat it in, or you can hold them and say them yourselves. We're looking for a really discussion-oriented session today. So I'm excited to introduce our two panelists. Alyssa Benedict is a trainer for the National Resource Center for Justice-Involved Women. She's the Executive Director of Court Associates and also a federal partner for the National Resource Center on Justice-Involved Women. Then we also have the Honorable Marcia Hirsch, who's the presiding judge of the Queen's Treatment Court. So we'll have a combination of hearing a little bit about some of the background in the research and then hearing how it's been implemented at the Queen's Treatment Court. So this is just a little reminder about the Justice Center. You can sign up for our newsletter, and we're also available on Twitter for more information. We have a court-specific roundup as well. So today, as I said, we'll be covering mental health courts, the essential role of trauma-informed care. That will be Alyssa's portion. And then Judge Hirsch will be talking about managing a trauma-informed courtroom, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. But please feel free to chat in as you go. And I think as Alyssa goes through, she'll have some questions to the group, so you can use the chat box to kind of answer her as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Alyssa Benedict.
Thanks, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to just start by positioning this conversation a bit in the landscape or larger context of our work. I was excited to do this webinar because the conversation about integrating trauma-informed care in corrections in particular through policy and practice changes, I think comes at a really interesting time. As we all know, there's been a really steady growth in the number of clients with mental health challenges, and individuals with these challenges are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, and study after study is showing that. It's pretty concerning, actually, when we look at the number of folks who are struggling in this way, and there are a lot of reasons for this overrepresentation in the system. You know, we all know that there's frequently a lack of services for individuals in their communities, and if a state and community mental health system doesn't have the capacity to either identify or serve individuals who have either emergent issues or actually outright serious mental health needs, we're obviously going to see more of them in our correction systems. And there's been very interesting cases of folks who are noticing spikes even in ER admissions with individuals with serious mental health issues in relation to closures of certain mental health or corrections programs. So we now know, and you can advance the next slide, that the criminal justice system is really a key player in the lives of individuals who are struggling with mental health challenges. And again, the distinction of those who have challenges versus those who have illnesses and individuals who have co-occurring disorders. So just to get grounded a bit, I wanted to just remind us all that we have this great definition of mental health that we've seen in several documents. It's a state of successful performance of mental function, results in things like productive activities, fulfilling relationships and social engagement with others, and importantly, the ability to adapt and change to conditions in one's life and to cope with various adversities. And we know that many of the individuals in our correction systems and our mental health courts in particular are really struggling to stay in this place of function, and they're lacking services and support. You've probably noted there's a lot of stigmatization of individuals who are struggling with mental illness, and with those conditions, their symptoms get worse. So the research is really saying loud and clear, without support, clients who have mental health challenges or illnesses will really end up developing more severe chronic conditions in the absence of some interventions. So thankfully, there's good news, right? I mean, we're all here because federal agencies of all kinds have technical assistance and support, providing funding for demonstration projects so that corrections agencies can really serve this population better. And we see a whole lot of creativity around the country and really in different countries around specialty courts, problem-solving courts. And so we're in this really exciting but critical position to create mental health courts that support those who are suffering, and not only that, but really actively create health and well-being where we can. And what makes me excited about that is any successes we have in our mental health courts, I think will really influence the larger success of our correction systems, and in fact, I think inspire the larger system to maybe adopt some of the practices right now that are isolated to problem solving or specialty courts. So I think there's some, to see yourselves as pioneers is a really important thing. You can advance to the next slide. Okay. So in this next slide, there's a couple of things to share. So if we're going to serve this population better, the point of this webinar is to make the case that trauma-informed care can help us get there. So we can stop this revolving door that we've all experienced in our direct service practice that has been identified in the literature numerous times, where individuals with mental illness really cycle in and out of the system over and over. They often get worse in that cycling process. So there's a call for trauma-informed corrections that comes at a time when we're really needing to address this revolving door. And I think there's this larger conversation, and I'd be interested in if you are hearing this in your respective states, about, there's a larger shift happening in corrections in general, where folks are looking to balance the traditional goals and objectives like public safety, certainly consequences that may be required for certain behaviors, but with innovation and really looking more holistically at the reasons people offend. A lot of these innovative responses, including mental health courts, are showing reduced offending and recidivism, and importantly, they're doing not just that. We see individuals really building successful lives in their communities, which is exactly what we want. So I wanted to show this sequential intercept model that's probably familiar to a lot of you, again, because it helps position this conversation, I think. It's a model that really helps us visualize different points of interception and where we can make interventions at each point to support individuals who are struggling with mental health issues. You know, the whole point of this visual is to show that if we provide support and diversion early on, then we will absolutely be, the whole spirit of prevention will be alive in our correction system. But we can really, again, stop this revolving door. So I wanted to put this up because that intercept point 3, that's where mental health courts live, right? And they're this critically important point of interception where there's this great opportunity to really facilitate diversion and healing. And so I think that's, mental health courts are really an important feature, an exciting feature of this whole conceptualization, mostly because they have this very important focus on this out-of-the-box thinking where there's collaboration with correction, mental health, social services, and various other systems. And again, mental health courts are really this emerging pioneer concept in that they're really doing the work of corrections differently. So as we look back at mental health courts, we see these great practices, these foundational partnerships that are facilitating great work. And as we look ahead, the focus today is on really saying, how can we build on that success and really enhance what we're doing in mental health courts by implementing trauma-informed care and make that intercept point as strong as it can possibly be for mental health courts. So you can advance to the next slide. So how do we do this? You know, how do we build on the successes? So the first thing is we have to acknowledge trauma as a universal experience, and this is for all people on the planet, but certainly as a very, very common experience among those who are involved in corrections in particular, and mental health courts in particular. Joan Galise, a dear colleague, she's a huge voice nationally on the importance of trauma-informed care, and she described it this way to me a few years back over lunch. She said, when you look at all these systems and the people that are in it, mental health, addiction, corrections, trauma is the gestalt. and I thought that was a very powerful way to describe it. She describes it as the organizing feature, the gestalt of individuals' involvement in these systems. It's the most common thing that ties their experiences together. So we have this huge task, so we need to acknowledge this universal experience and also acknowledge the fact that before folks come to us in our mental health courts, they've likely not really had an opportunity to seek treatment. They may be less likely to seek treatment. The research shows that. In a lot of studies, they're suffering alone, and they're doing their best to survive the impacts of their trauma. And the things they're doing are often getting them involved in the criminal justice system. So they're displaying behaviors as a way to cope with their lives that are getting them into trouble. And a lot has happened before they walk through our doors, and we're accounting for all of that when we begin our work in mental health courts. So that's a lot. So we in mental health courts can either make matters better or worse, and what I found in visiting different jurisdictions around the country is that unintentionally in a lot of corrections practices we're causing problems among trauma survivors. We don't mean to, but sometimes the basics of what we do as part of court practices just inevitably are triggering, and sometimes there are things that we can do that are part of our requirement, like urine tests, for example. We can do those better. We can do that in a trauma-informed way. Or there are certain things that we're doing that we don't have to do anymore. For instance, speaking in excessively authoritative ways to clients as part of court processes, or embarrassing clients as part of court processes. You can move to the next slide. So once we've kind of considered this backdrop and we understand the role that trauma plays in the lives of our clients and the mental illness that they are experiencing, the substance abuse, the criminality, we really need to work together in our courts and implement trauma-informed care. And at times, this is going to require that we move through some really, really hard conversations as a team about how we pull this off, because trauma-informed care implementation requires a shift in philosophy and practices in many ways. So if we're willing to move through those difficult conversations and support each other through those different conversations, we're already on a strong path. You can go to the next slide. And so there's a lot of barriers along the way that I wanted to honor these barriers as experiences that we all have in doing this difficult work. One of them is that trauma can get lost in the weed, meaning there's a lot of things that we have to do, a lot of issues that we're managing as part of our mental health court work. Clients' issues in themselves are very difficult in terms of managing things like homelessness, joblessness, parenting struggles, day-to-day stressors that clients bring. All of these things, of course, impacting their motivation, their participation, whether or not they show up to treatment, to court dates. And we also have procedures to implement and paperwork to do. We have often understaffing issues and other operational concerns that we live with every day. And trauma as a discussion and a point of implementation can get lost in all of that. And it's very understandable. The second thing is, even in the best of circumstances, which we really aren't operating within very frequently, any of us, we can over-specialize, meaning we can tend to create silos and conversations about one issue, like mental health, and talk about it separately from substance abuse and separately from trauma. And often our referrals can be kind of unidimensional in that way. Sometimes we take a client, we identify a list of issues and are trying to plug in supports. And sometimes we really need to be thinking more holistically about the client, but also providing the services in a holistic and comprehensive way. Sometimes that literally requires a restructuring of some of the community services. So it's a tall task to begin these conversations because they'll require some shifts. And then thirdly, stakeholders sometimes don't share the same either awareness of trauma and its impacts or the same motivation to implement trauma-informed care. For some folks, it may seem like just another thing on their to-do list, and that's understandable as well. A lot of the research on trauma, although it's been around for a while, there's been a more recent push in terms of understanding its impact on corrections populations and in corrections practice. And some folks have been steeped in that thinking more than others, and you may find yourself working with a team that really has different levels of awareness and motivation, and that's normal as well. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that operationalization, the kind of how-to, putting it into practice, is really, really hard work. It's what I spend my days doing with my consultation and training, helping folks take the research and really implement it in a way that will be relevant not only for their population, but for their staffing pattern, their community, their state, the politics, the economics. There's a lot that needs to be considered to really make trauma-informed care come to life as part of our mental health core operations. So the implementation piece is the hardest yet most important. You can advance to the next slide. So as mental health coordinators, court coordinators, and other stakeholders, there's this huge task we have as, we're managing this interface of criminal justice and mental health, this kind of emerging interface. For years, these were very, very separate systems. And so with, federal support and innovation, we see this critical dialogue and, convergence of these systems in terms of treating and supporting those struggling with mental health challenges and mental illness. And many of you have identified some of the specific challenges that you're facing in your role, so I wanted to include those here as well. The three that are highlighted are the ones that you all noted. These are the three biggest things that you're dealing with that are challenges. The first being raising awareness about the impact of trauma and the importance of trauma-informed care among the various players in mental health courts. The other being addressing it as part of court-based assessment. And this third one's a really big one, implementing trauma-informed care in the courtroom as part of the processes. And all of these are important and dear to my heart. But that last one's a big one because it's, again, really about how to bring it to life, this notion of trauma-informed care when you're actually facilitating courtroom processes, which I'll talk a little bit about, but certainly Judge Hirsch will continue that dialogue as well. So let's get grounded in some of the basics on trauma before we dive into some of these. We won't be able to cover all of them, but certainly some of them. So you can advance to the next slide. So the information that's just captured on this particular PowerPoint is covered more in depth on a webinar that was previously offered by CSG that can be provided to you if you'd like to view that material that goes through in more detail trauma and what its impacts are. But as we move into the how-to and implementation conversation, I just wanted to bring us to this notion that we really need to keep in mind as we're thinking how to bring trauma-informed care to life in a courtroom, that the impacts of trauma they're significant and they're not just psychological. They're neurophysiological and relational. So that for a long time the discourse was about how trauma can really adversely impact self-esteem, cause anxiety and depression. Clients may feel like damaged goods, etc. Sleeplessness. The neurophysiological piece has been emergent in the last five to 10 years, and this research is really transforming how folks in corrections think about their work. And it's showing us that trauma lives in the body. Its impacts really live in the body, and survivors are dealing with significant distress from the neck down. It's not just about feeling sad and upset and really struggling with what has happened psychologically, but having literally the regulation in the body can be off. Someone can feel very unglued, for example. And then we know now when we think about that research that a lot of what we do in corrections, however necessary, can trigger that neurophysiological distress in the body. Someone can literally start to become jittery or mask that with anger and yelling if they're feeling afraid in the courtroom, for instance. So the good news is that the stability that we can offer happens when we are attending to this relational social context. That's that ecological piece on the right. So if we know that, certainly trauma occurs in a relational social context, but so too does the healing of trauma. And so the interactions that we create in mental health courts, be it on the treatment side in the courtroom, at team meetings, and all these different processes that are embedded in what we call mental health court, what we do can be stabilizing and really increase motivation and engagement of our clients, or be destabilizing and decrease those things. And so we want to make sure that we're doing our best to implement trauma-informed care in such a way that we're creating that stability, because the research shows when that stability is experienced by clients, that distress in the body calms down, and they have a much more ability to attune to goals, engage parts of the brain that are about decision-making and executive functioning. If those things are turned off because a trauma survivor is in distress, because they feel, for instance, afraid in a courtroom, that they literally will not have access to some of the thinking capacities in that moment that they need to actually move through the mental health court program. So these things are important to keep in mind as we're talking about the what next. What should our mental health courts look like and sound like to be trauma-informed? You can advance to the next slide. And so I think the principles of trauma-informed care that are noted here are really important. They offer almost a kind of roadmap as we think about how to implement trauma-informed practices in our respective mental health courts, because every court is different, has its own culture, has its own strengths and challenges. So there's a lot of latitude around how you might say you can make your mental health court, including every aspect of its function, more in line with these principles of safety, trust, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. This picture is actually from an article in 2014 entitled "Sinking into Mental Illness in the Criminal Justice Abyss: How the Sick Get Sicker." So the title alone of that article is very motivating to me personally, for sure, around how to avoid this sinking and how critical mental health courts, that role that they play, how critical they are in preventing this. And so again, this notion of, okay, so what does it look like? So it looks like these things, this notion of making sure that clients in every aspect of mental health court programming and operations, that they're experiencing a sense of safety, trust with the people in that immediate environment, given some choices and options, that we're collaborating with them and offering opportunities for them to experience empowerment. So even if you look at how traditional courtroom processes unfold, they often don't really bring these principles to life. But specialty courts, mental health courts are known to begin to offer a more collaborative, empowering approach. So we can really build on the strengths of our courts already and kind of take it further in terms of implementing trauma-informed care. But some of the things to consider as you're determining, and I'm thinking of the survey you all filled out around how hard it is to get the word out. One of the strategies we have to use is to encourage a conversation with stakeholders about what will be hard about implementing these principles, and just to be honest about putting that on the table, as I think there's a lot of folks, often with great intentions, who are really struggling with the apparent incompatibility of these principles with traditional correctional practice. There's a sense that, ooh, how do these two go together? And what I'm finding in various aspects of the correction system, including prisons, is that they absolutely can go together. They can be integrated beautifully. And in fact, these principles of trauma-informed care help us raise the bar of correctional practice in general. It's really helping us shift what we know to be corrections and better realize the vision of mental health courts. You can advance to the next slide. So one of the recommendations I wanted to offer today is to bring stakeholders together to address this idea of trauma and trauma-informed care. And if you have done so in the past and you feel like, wow, we did have a conversation about this and I think folks are still struggling, or I think we're in agreement on its importance, but we're not sure how it ought to shift our practices, just really encourage some of these really tried and true methods of bringing folks together, like either dedicated meetings, brown bag lunches, maybe something more formal and like a summit, and it can be small or large. It could be based on just your team, or you might involve many more stakeholders, certainly conferences, workshops, in-services, viewing a webinar like this and then talking after, just to tackle some of the important questions on the left, to see where your group of collaborators is at. How are they defining trauma and its impact? What are their thoughts on these principles of trauma-informed care that are promoted pretty much globally now, not just in the U.S. What's the mission of their particular court and the collaboration? What are the goals, and how do we fit trauma-informed care into that? And how do we improve our respective practices? So for each role and function in the mental health court to say, here's what I can do better, and then how do we as a collective do better? How do we identify challenges as we're doing the work of trauma-informed care? How do we celebrate successes? And how do we self-reflect and self-correct to make sure that we're constantly growing? So these are questions that I think up front can be raised, and if they've been raised before, you might raise them differently. And certainly any of us on this webinar are available via email or phone to field some of these questions about how to have the conversation, especially if you've had it and you felt that it didn't go as well as you had hoped. You can advance to the next slide. And so there are so many elements of mental health court to consider in terms of implementing trauma-informed care, but I always like to talk about the team because I see the team as kind of the foundation and who the collaborators are and how they interface. This is a picture of Judge Deanna Farnell, who heads up a drug court in Florida. And so she and her team are pictured here. And as I'm talking about this, I just want to invite you to type in anything you notice just about this picture that reflects how this team functions. If there's just anything, if you really take a look at what this picture conveys, feel free to type that in, and I'll certainly comment on it as well. But one of the things that really stands out certainly is Judge Farnell's expression and her engagement with others and attentiveness. And I had the opportunity to observe quite a few of this court's practices and found that the team was this essential foundational element, and even the space they sat in and how they used that space was trauma-informed. Encouraging imagery on the wall, color, sitting in circle, people all having a chance to offer perspective, etc. So it was a very engaging atmosphere that created a sense of comfort even when you walked in. You can advance to the next slide. And some of the key elements, as I mentioned, when we think about how the team should function, just a way to really think about, how is my team doing? And it may be the team that shows up in the courtroom or a larger group of collaborators. However you conceptualize team, thinking of these principles of trauma-informed care noted at the top of the slide, how does our team live out those principles? So, who shows up and how? The composition certainly matters of the team, the who, like who is there. And there's a lot of time spent to make sure the right players are there. But how we show up as team members is critical in terms of the ideas we bring and how we bring them. So the quote on the right, honest disagreement is often a good sign of progress. I get concerned when I see a team that's not having any level of disagreement. Disagreement means that folks are challenging each other, and if it's respectful and engaging, we can see some real progress and maybe in some new decisions that set the stage for a new way of responding to a particular challenge that was noted in one or more clients. And a shared philosophy is key and really cannot be assumed, right? I mean, sometimes we assume, hey, we all signed on to this grant together and we all implemented it together. But when you get to the nitty-gritty of philosophy, who are the clients? Why are they here? What's our role? What's our role when things get tough, like relapse, reoffending? That's when I think there's a lot more divergence than we realize. So to have those conversations and then end with a shared philosophy that everyone's clear on is really important. And to certainly honor the notion that we all have different roles, and with those roles, perspectives that are really key. So at a meeting I was at once, a team meeting, one of the members said, what is wrong with her? I mean, this is the 5th time she relapsed, and she came here for support. She said she wanted it. It's like she doesn't even care. And another team member said, well, she's struggling with her symptoms. They're really strong for her, and I think that's why she's saying that. She seems cavalier, but I think there's more to the story. And they started to challenge each other, and those dialogues I think are really, really important. Having a clear team process, especially around decision-making, again, it seems like a no-brainer. I can't tell you how many team processes I've seen where there's not a clear decision-making process, particularly around areas of disagreement and managing complexity and, how is it okay to get creative with certain clients? checking in frequently, even outside of team meetings. And this one on the bottom, self-care, is a really important one. You're not getting hijacked by our own fears, disappointments, and negative thinking. Work in corrections is hard. Work in specialty and problem-solving courts like mental health courts is hard. We see a lot. We see a lot of suffering. We see a lot of stops and starts, 5 steps forward for a client, 10 steps back. It can be very overwhelming. So any opportunity for us to really not only work on our own self-care, but to provide self-care opportunities as a team, bringing in food, coffee, tea, having some time to kind of debrief and let off steam in healthy professional ways can be very helpful. You can advance to the next slide. And so this slide, and I can forward you more information on this. There's a whole training piece on this around self-care, as many of you know. But the 3 R's are just a quick thing that we can do when we're feeling our own agitation around a client or even a colleague. To take a minute to just recognize what's going on with me, to regulate ourselves a bit. What can I do? Do I need to excuse myself, grab a quick drink, make a quick phone call, step outside, sit in my seat and take some breaths without people realizing it? And then how do I respond? And if it's just a quick way to get ourselves in our own place of regulation and stability, so that when we talk, speak, and act, it's coming from that stability and not from our disappointment or anger. So again, I've seen a lot of team members speak to each other and clients in ways that seem to really reflect their own anger and fear, and not necessarily what's happening in reality in front of them. You can advance to the next slide. And so this is a picture of Judge Farnell's courtroom. And again, I invite you to type in anything that you notice about the space there, because the courtroom and what happens in it, and Judge Hirsch will be talking a lot about this, is so important. So it's another element. It's not the only one of a mental health court that's important to consider. But some of the things that I noticed right away when I first visited was that there was color, there was life, there was acknowledgement of accomplishments. There was, I obviously didn't include pictures of the entire room, but messages of hope, client supports like a rack of calendars and planners for clients, tables for veterans, and information and services that they may ask. I mean, it just had life in it, and hope and opportunity. In this case, it's a drug court, not a mental health court, but there's certainly a mental health caseload involved, and there was just very specific things done to the visual space to make this courtroom have life, hope, and a sense of opportunity. You can advance to the next slide. And so when we talk about these principles of trauma-informed care and how to bring them alive in the courtroom, some elements to consider. Judge Farnell and others talk about the courtroom as an extension of the treatment space. So I just love that notion that it's not that we do treatment and support outside of the courtroom and then comment on it within it. The courtroom itself is a vehicle for treatment and support. So you want to set those conditions for support, certainly in the ways that I already described from that picture, but others, like for instance, how the team functions in the courtroom makes a difference. So I've noticed too, if the team is cohesive and respectful of one another, they often bring that to the clients. When there's a lot of conflict at a team, you feel it in the courtroom, and the clients feel it. They pick up on it. The nonverbals are big. We know 80% of communication is nonverbal, and clients are certainly aware of that, and trauma survivors are super aware of that. They have learned the hard way to be very in tune to their environment and the safety of that environment. So there's this notion of having the team function positively outside of the courtroom, to bring that into the courtroom and to create a situation where there's a feeling of safety. Everyone matters in the courtroom, be it the judge, the clerk, bailiff, providers, prosecutors, public defenders, attorneys, etc., and to have the expectation through these conversations about how everyone will act. In some courts I've been in, I think it's really powerful when the providers are consistently present and physically stand up when their client is going before the judge, not in an authoritative way, but in a supportive way, to kind of be a witness and a presence, no matter what has happened with that client in the previous weeks. And then again, what we say and how we say it matters, the language that we use. So, things like violation of probation, I hear in a lot of court processes, stakeholders of all kinds will call, you know, a male who has violated probation a VOP, for instance. So he's a VOP now. And I know it doesn't seem like a big deal, but it's a kind of an objectifying statement, right? Versus that he has violated probation and these are the reasons. It sets up a different attitude in your mind about that human being. I've heard phrases like she's a drama queen or he's just a bad seed, where we kind of write clients off because we're forgetting, I think, in our own stress to see that there's a huge amount of experience that is fueling a particular behavior, like using again, someone who's showed up to their mental health treatment that's required for 4 or 5 weeks and then they drop out and say, oh, they're just not motivated. There's almost always something else happening, and our words and our exploration of what's going on needs to be really respectful and give us a chance of understanding, gee, what is going on here? What I've noticed that goes well in some of the statements I've heard in courtrooms, things like when the judge says, I'm mindful of your time and I appreciate you being here, when she or he first enters the room. Judge Farnell and others sometimes do a sort of homily where they speak to the group in a very welcoming way and maybe highlight a holiday that's coming up. They may talk about a salient issue and introduce a quote. When I visited Judge Farnell's courtroom, she read a poem and got some feedback from folks in the room about what that meant to them, or just had them think about it. Statements like, I believe in the power of reinvention, and I know you are all working hard. I'm so glad you're here. Accommodating those with children, I think, is a really important thing to do as well. And trying to, I think ideas like even reducing the number of folks on the docket where possible can be helpful, particularly those who are struggling with serious symptoms, and the act of just showing up and being with other people in a courtroom can be so dysregulating and trauma triggering. So how you even handle the docket and the flow into the room and where people sit, and there's so many things that can be more trauma informed. Again, can't talk about all of them today, but just to get us thinking about ideas like this. You can advance to the next slide. And so this notion of creating regulation and resilience I wanted to share with you. So if we know that being regulated as a trauma survivor means you can tolerate the difficult thoughts, feelings, sensations that you're experiencing as a result of your traumatic experiences, you can connect with self and others and engage effectively in action. So that's what we want as part of our mental health courts in their operations from soup to nuts, right? Whether clients are working with providers, seeing a judge in a courtroom, whoever they're interfacing with, we want to make sure that we're creating conditions that facilitate this type of regulation. And then when we do that, we see resilience. We see that clients can access and utilize skills and strengths. They can cope with stressors, and instead of not showing up, for instance, they may make a call and reach out to a provider for help. That's what we see when folks are becoming more trauma informed. We see clients reaching out for support instead of bottoming out. And then we see the ability to set and achieve goals. A client I met about a month ago is now graduating with her master's degree and achieving goals that she's really proud of because of her experience in a mental health court. So these are the things that we're trying to create. You can advance to the next slide. And then just some other examples around how to do this: increasing of regulation and resilience, reducing crowding, as I mentioned, maybe having dedicated days where just women show up. That if you have that luxury where you can do that, I really encourage that. Certainly setting a tone in the courtroom before seeing the first case, the visual space we talked about, the relational space, who's there, where they sit, how they sit, what eye contact they make and when they stand. All of these are very subtle but vital cues for trauma survivors, and the communication that we mentioned. And balancing support and accountability, this notion that there's a way to deliver a consequence and make it clear that there's been a violation and something needs to happen, but do that in a very supportive way. And to debunk this myth that we can be trauma informed until there's been a rule violation. When there's been a rule violation and when a client is struggling, it's actually more important than ever to be trauma informed. So in this picture, Judge Farnell, the client before her had relapsed, and when instead of just getting into why that's wrong and how she shouldn't have done that. Judge Farnell opened it up and said, tell me what's going on. And the client did share a very distressing example of having buried her mother that weekend and how that was unbearable for her and she ended up using. And you can tell by Judge Farnell and how she's standing, you can see the empathy. And so whatever consequences need to stand can stand, but to infuse empathy into that conversation is extremely regulating and offers hope and great respect. And in this case, she said, "You've done such a great job. Let's talk about what comes next," in a very even, clear tone. Next slide. And so the last thing I wanted to mention before I pass this on to Judge Hirsch is, again, there's so many elements to talk about, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention the treatment component of mental health courts and the various players who offer treatment and support. And again, these principles of trauma-informed care, how we might bring those to life. So in treatment programs, when I visit treatment programs and often conduct trauma-informed, gender-responsive assessments to see, what are the strengths in terms of providing trauma-informed care, where are there opportunities to make improvements. So, of course, we want to consider what the treatment philosophy is and its attention to trauma. And just like we analyze the courtroom in terms of its visual space, we can do the same thing in treatment programs, be them community-based, 24-hour residential. What is the space like? How do we move through management and operations? Where is there an opportunity to be more trauma-informed there? Our staffing and how we train our staff to be trauma-informed. The culture is key. I noticed there's a lot of triggering happening with how clients communicate with each other and interact with each other in treatment programs. And there's a way to structure even casual interactions and downtime in such a way that it's more trauma-informed. How we manage violations of program rules and the language around that, assessment, classification, the programs we provide and their attention to trauma. So there are all these elements even within the provider community, whether, again, you're a 24-hour residential or community-based non-residential, there are these components that you can consider in terms of how to enhance the trauma-informed care within each one. And I have some documentation on these elements and how to be more trauma-informed within each that I can pass on to you as well. So I'll just end with some powerful quotes from clients and professionals. One is from a client: "This court saved my life. My rape was underneath everything I was doing. I was in chains. Those chains are broken now. I'm free and I can breathe again." And for a corrections professional said to me, "I never realized how this work was affecting me. Being trauma-informed is not just about the clients, it's about us too. We've all experienced some kind of trauma and this approach helps all of us. I'm not only better at my job, I'm better at life." So, and this is someone who's really been learning about trauma-informed care and implementing it as a professional. So I'll end there, and I'm very excited to pass this on to Judge Hirsch to talk about, her elements of managing a courtroom, et cetera.
Okay, thank you, Alyssa. You're a tough act to follow. I'm going to hopefully build upon your slides and the information that you presented. For those of you who don't know me, I sit in Queens County in New York City. It's one of the 5 boroughs. I have 2.2 million people in my county. And we are a true melting pot. 62 different languages are spoken in my county. So we pride ourselves on being culturally competent and dealing with our very, very diverse population. The 5 felony treatment courts that I preside over include the drug treatment court, the mental health court, the DWI treatment court, the Queens Veterans Court, and the drug diversion court for the hardened criminal and people who essentially have long rap sheets and are really doing reentry type programs with us. Our collaborators include the Queens District Attorney's Office. We are very, very fortunate to have a very supportive district attorney in Richard Brown, who really believes in the work that we do and the wonderful results that we get. The Defense Bar, Queens Task, who does our case management services, and the New York State Departments of Probation, New York City Department of Education, and with our Veterans Court, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, which includes our Veterans Justice Outreach Coordinator, who's a key member of our team. We applied for a CSAT grant way back in 2009 to fund our trauma project. We came upon the trauma issue, we kind of fell upon it when we realized that we had 10 young people in our court who were struggling, and nothing that we did seemed to be working in addressing both their substance abuse issues and their mental health issues. So we started to look and see what they had in common. And once we started digging, we found out that all 10 of them had been adopted. So then we started to ask the questions behind that. What about the adoption experience, and this also applies equally to those of you who work with foster children, what about that experience held them back from succeeding in our program, and what did we need to do better as a team to help them build the resiliency to move forward with their lives in a positive direction, and to also get them out from being stuck and mired in their past, whether it be with their addiction, substance abuse issues, or finally getting them to deal with the mental health issues that they may be fighting. So we then applied for our grant. It was a 3-year grant that we received. We've worked through that grant very, very successfully, and I'm happy to report that we now service anyone who is assessed for trauma. We service them through our treatment providers, and we partnered with the next slide will show the 3 treatment providers who we worked with, which include Samaritan Village, the counseling services of the Eastern District of New York, and Elm Corps Youth and Adult Activities. So our goals are to provide trauma-specific treatment to our participants. We had to guarantee 40 a year. That was not very difficult. Once we started actually screening for trauma, we found that those numbers well exceeded 100. So we worked with policy research associates in defining and devising the best assessment mechanisms that we could use to screen for trauma. So what we would do with our people when they're assigned to our mental health court and our other courts as well is we would screen them for trauma. As Alyssa indicated, why we learn about trauma is to develop I think I'm probably a couple slides ahead. Develop an understanding, increase the awareness, recognize signs, learn how to respond, improve courtroom interactions, and create successful outcomes. Our practical tools here are, first of all, we decided that we were going to train everyone on our team. So not only did we train the 3 treatment providers we partnered with, but we trained all the other 30 providers who we worked with in our county. We invited everyone to come to any of our trauma training sessions. We trained our court clerks, our court officers. We trained our educational, vocational, and housing staff, and all of the other stakeholders in our community who would come. Alyssa mentioned stakeholders. Since we opened our mental health court back in 2005, we opened with a team of stakeholders, and since that time, we still hold quarterly meetings. Every 3 months, we get together with our stakeholders, and we discuss issues of interest to our mental health community partners, and that way we're allowed to exchange ideas, to see what new programs are out there, what new programs may be opening in our community that we didn't know about, new treatment modalities, and we talk about our issues of concern and how we can all work together to do our job better. We also learned from the beginning that there were some very simple things that we could do to be sure that our participants in our courts were not going to be re-traumatized when they came to court. Simple things like courtroom management and calendar management make a big difference. I have one woman in my mental health court right now. As a matter of fact, I saw her this morning, and she gets extremely nervous whenever the court officer brings in anyone from the pens and when they're wearing handcuffs. She sits there and visibly starts to shake. My sergeant in my courtroom came up to me one day and he said, you know, Ms. So-and-so is really stressed out when she sees people come in from the pens. Do you think maybe we can handle her case first so that she's not affected by that? So it's just those little things that once you look at them from the eyes of our participants, you can make those adjustments. So now we handle her case toward the beginning of our calendar, and she's very happy with that, and we don't re-traumatize her in any way, shape, or form by upsetting her, seeing people come into the courtroom and possibly in jumpsuits and handcuffs. We also learned right away that we had to be flexible. We had to have reasonable expectations because we can't expect the same level of compliance from individuals with very different mental health diagnoses, substance abuse issues, and different levels of cognitive functioning. So really, one size does not fit all. We have to be flexible with the people that we're speaking with. I'm not going to have the same discussion with the gentleman in my court who has an MBA as I am with a person who has a borderline IQ of maybe 75. So the judge and your treatment court team have to learn to ask your questions in different ways and to treat everyone with dignity and respect, and you meet them where they're at when they enter into your courtroom. Another thing about the assessments that we use, it's very, very important to have a good assessment, but I think the other thing you have to realize is when someone first walks into your court, a lot of times they're terrified about being there, and they may not open up right away and want to discuss about past traumatic events and experiences that they had. So you may have to work with them for a little while before you even want to administer the different trauma screens. You may have to address their substance abuse issues first. You definitely also want to address their mental health issues. Be sure that they have a correct mental health diagnosis. Be sure that they're medication compliant. Only then will you really want to discuss the traumatic issues that have happened so that you can then refer them to the appropriate trauma services provider. It's really important to obtain the most information that you can about your participant, because only then will you be able to address the needs of their treatment plan. If you can, sometimes we found it really important to get information from other family members. We learned with one woman in my court who successfully graduated 2 weeks ago, she was denying all kinds of trauma when she first came to us, yet her sister, who she had been very, very close to, provided a lot of missing pieces from her past. Her sister was able to tell us that our participant was sexually abused by her father for 5 years between the ages of 5 and 10. She was able to tell us other incidents from her sister's past that were really helpful for our team so that we could finally get her sister the help that she really needed and address the trauma issues from her past. Also, I know all of us get all of those various consent forms signed when we have people begin our programs. It's really important to let those consent forms be living, working documents. Call the other people who are on the consent form. Speak to the professionals, if there are psychiatrists, if they're therapists, if they're family therapists. Sometimes it's a medical doctor who you may need to speak to about an underlying medical condition. We've certainly seen that with our participants. Unfortunately, just because people are in mental health court, their life doesn't stop. Things go on. Family members get sick, they get sick, they get diagnosed with serious mental illness, serious physical illnesses, as well as the mental illnesses and substance abuse that they're dealing with. So a good assessment and good corroborating information is really, really important, and it helps to open that dialogue with the other treating professionals so that you are all on the same page. Also, be aware of possible triggers, smells, sounds, sensations, things that provoke memories of past traumatic experiences. I really see this with my veteran population. A lot of times they will talk about certain smells, burning rubber, sounds like backfiring cars on the street, just noises, part of everyday city life that really trigger them and send them into a state of panic. Also be aware of anniversaries. We find with our mental health court population in particular, know the significant anniversaries in the lives of the people in front of you. Sometimes people have lost family members, close family members have died. We had a woman in mental health court who had buried her son the year before as a result of a heroin overdose. We knew that his one-year anniversary death was going to be a trigger for her, and so we were aware of that. When she relapsed at the one-year anniversary, we were not surprised. We did not sanction her harshly. We said we knew she was experiencing a difficult time in her life, and we were there to help her, and what could we do to help her get through this time? So we have learned from the research and from evidence-based practice analyses that there are certain responses that are more effective, including those that deal with the individual's gender. Alyssa mentioned possibly even holding court for the women on certain days and for the men on other days. Certain trauma groups are done for women and others for men. It's also essential to integrate the trauma-specific treatment with the other treatments being received, including mental health and substance abuse treatment. And we must utilize group environments to build trust and enhance healing. I had a young woman in my court this morning who told me she's in a residential program, and she told me that the groups were going well. She liked what the counselors were saying in the groups, but she felt that the other members of the group were bullying her when they were going around the room. Our team was very, very concerned about that, and we asked her case manager to have a discussion with the program about that and to report back to us on the next court appearance, and also to speak individually with this participant to give her some strategies for dealing with her perception of being bullied and what kind of responses she could give and what kinds of things she could say and ask the other people so that she did not feel like she was being bullied in group. Effective communication is essential. My approach is definitely conversational. I want to know what's going on in the people's lives in front of me. I want to know what's going on that very week. So I will ask them what they were talking about in treatment this week, what they like to do in their free time, what's going on, what were the topics of discussion. And you'd be amazed to hear the responses that you get when they open up and start sharing. We have found that when trauma protocols are used, it usually takes only about 4 weeks. And the trauma, we're going to discuss the different trauma interventions in a minute, but it usually only takes about 4 weeks to begin to see the positive effects in our participants. They begin to immediately make better eye contact. They don't answer the questions monosyllabically. They're more eager to share. You can just see it's easier to engage them, and they also smile more readily. So you can really tell when the trauma protocols are working and the people are beginning to feel the benefit of them. So we do express concern. We give positive feedback. We talk about the fact that they may be struggling, they may be having a difficult time, and we also want their input. When we really see people who are getting very frustrated with treatment and with their progress through our various phases, it's not unusual for us to ask them, what do you need? How can we help you succeed? And, you know, if we listen to what they're telling us, a lot of times we will find the answers on how we can help them. Sometimes people will request more one-on-one individual therapy. Sometimes they'll request a particular type of treatment. Sometimes they'll say they just didn't, their psychiatrist canceled their appointment for last month, and they're going to have to wait another month to see that person, and they really missed that appointment. Sometimes they want to express their concerns about their medication. So we have to find out what they need and address those needs. Sometimes it's just scheduling another appointment, getting them more one-on-one time, getting them additional groups, whatever they need. Sometimes it's dealing with other issues. Sometimes it's getting them respite care if they're helping take care of an elderly parent, or if they have child care issues. Sometimes it's those outside factors that they're struggling with and that are holding them back. So sometimes we just need to know what they need from us. I had a gentleman in my court who had a 4-year-old child who was diagnosed with autism. Well, our education person was able to get early childhood intervention for that child, and that immediately reduced a lot of his anxiety and allowed him to focus on his own needs and his own care, because he was so wrapped up in trying to navigate all of the special services that were out there for his child that he couldn't function and focus on his own recovery. The different traumatic events, most of these you know about, including physical abuse, loss, especially with my veterans and with a lot of my immigrants, because we are a county of immigrants. Those who were combat veterans or who were victims of war or oppression, especially we see in Central America, a lot of people who talk about experiences in their country and what's going on with various family members there. Community trauma, sexual abuse, next slide, domestic violence, people who witness violence or other traumatic events. That even includes my younger participants who may have witnessed gang violence and stood next to a good friend who was shot over the weekend on the street corner. These are the stories that we hear on an ongoing basis in our court. Historical trauma, terrorism. Those of us in New York who lived through 9/11 or in Washington, D.C., we are still seeing our participants deal with the impact of 9/11 terrorism. I have a Vietnam veteran who finally, after 10 months in treatment, admitted in court that he made a major breakthrough. And that breakthrough was whenever he saw the slides on and the film on the anniversary of 9/11 and saw One World Trade Center collapse, he was reminded of the horrific event where his sister perished. And he said that losing his sister on 9/11 was far worse than anything he did or saw in Vietnam in 2 tours of duty there. So sometimes people have to make those kinds of connections before they're able to move on and put the events in perspective and figure out ways and coping mechanisms for themselves to deal with those events. Natural disasters, a lot of all of the different parts of our country see natural disasters from tornadoes, hurricanes, mudslides, everything that you can imagine. In New York, when we had Superstorm Sandy hit, a lot of my people were flooded out of their apartments completely because a lot of them lived in basement apartments, and when the water came in, it always goes to the basement apartments first, and unfortunately I had people lose every single piece of identification that they had, every family photograph that they had, different souvenirs from events that were very, very special to them. So we have to be aware that natural disasters can strike at any time. You can leave work on Friday and come into a totally different, changed world on Monday. Betrayal of trust by a person or an institution. We see that with some of our sexual abuse cases with respect to religious authority figures. We've had a few of those cases in our part as well. So I'm going to kind of skip through what trauma is, because I think we kind of all know how trauma is pervasive and how it does shape the worldview of the participant. And it's interesting to note that 3 people can watch the same traumatic event and experience it in very different ways. One person can just, I know Joan Galice, who Alyssa mentioned earlier, she gives the example of the people on the street corner who witnessed the same horrible car accident. And one person gets up the next morning and is fine and goes on with his life, and the next person is very, very concerned and stays in bed for a couple of days but kind of gets over it. And the third person, you may not see that person in work for the next month because for whatever reasons in their past, the car accident really impacted them and they're not able to get out of bed and function for a little while. So everyone experiences trauma very, very differently. We also know that short-term effects of trauma can include substance abuse, both drugs and alcohol, interpersonal violence, gambling, other risky behavior, and the long-term effects can include arrest, incarceration, and recidivism. High ACE scores, the Adverse Childhood Experience Scale, are associated with depression, suicide attempts, hallucinations, and various diseases, including liver disease, heart disease, and autoimmune diseases. Childhood trauma, we know, can also increase the likelihood of smoking, drinking excessively, overeating, self-injury. We see that with a lot of our younger people with cutting and other injurious behavior, and engaging in risky sex. We know that those behaviors are known as coping mechanisms. We also know childhood trauma adversely affects brain development and hinders the ability of the person to respond to stress. The next slide is a figure of the process of trauma. I'm not going to spend much time on that. These were the scores that were reported when we did our ACE inventory with our participants. And when I mentioned to you earlier that people aren't going to be as likely to be honest at the very beginning, that's what we found with these numbers. 74% reported a score of 0 to 2. Later on, we learned those numbers are really, really very, very low. People did not want to address or admit to as many of the items as really may have happened in their life. They were not able to deal with those issues at the very beginning. So what we've learned to do is administer the different trauma screens further along. So if we believe the person is ready at 3 months, we might administer it at 3. Sometimes it may take 6 months for the person to be open and honest enough to respond to the questions that are asked. We do also use the trauma symptom checklist and the PTSD checklist, the civilian version. We stopped using the combat exposure scale because we found that that actually traumatized our veterans. Every one of our veterans did register high on the trauma panel. However, we noticed that they would get visibly upset when they were asked, and the combat trauma scale does actually ask questions about, did you see anyone get killed? Did you ever kill anyone? Did you ever have to deal with body parts? And it really visibly upset our veterans, so we do not use the combat exposure scale anymore at all. So that's another way of our program adapting to, based upon our own experiences. I'd like to just go over now what the various trauma programs and modalities. Here, okay, here we go. The treatment interventions. The case managers that were hired by the 3 treatment providers that we partnered with received training in these 3 interventions. The first one being the TAMAR model, Trauma, Addictions, Mental Health, and Recovery. This program is terrific. We use it, initially, the people who developed it thought it was going to be used pretty much exclusively among women, but we've had success using it with men as well. And it's a free intervention. You do not have to pay anyone to use it. And it is designed to educate and treat those who have a history of physical and/or sexual abuse and a recent treatment history for mental health condition as well as alcohol, drug use, or abuse disorder. It's a structured, manualized 15-week intervention. It combines psychoeducational approaches with expressive therapies that include talking about various issues, traumatic issues from your past, writing about them. And the terrific thing about all 3 of these interventions is that you don't have to start at chapter number 1. So you can have different people enter in, say, week 5 or week 10, and they'll just stay until they complete the full cycle, but each chapter is independent. So it discusses different issues in a person's life, and it really, really stirs some really good discussions in the groups. And I've had a lot of women who've done TAMAR who were so sad when the 15-week intervention was over that they agreed to meet on their own and have coffee at least once a month so that they could get together and continue discussing the issues that they discussed while doing the TAMAR groups. The next group, intervention that we use is Seeking Safety. Now, all of our providers were trained. We paid out of our grant to have everyone all of our treatment providers attend a training with us and receive the materials for Seeking Safety. However, Seeking Safety can be expensive. So for those of you who are writing brand new grant applications out there, you can definitely include Seeking Safety in your grant if you feel that you would like to have some of your treatment providers offer that in their programs for your participants. Seeking Safety offers coping skills to help clients attain greater safety in their lives. It's very, very flexible. It can be used for both groups or for individual formats. You can use it with women, with men, with adolescents, and at all levels of care, outpatient, inpatient, residential. All types of trauma and substances are dealt with and focused upon. And any clinician, once they are trained in the workbook method and receive training from the certified Seeking Safety trainers, can provide Seeking Safety treatment. There are 25 treatment topics there, and each represents a safe coping skill that's relevant to both people experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder and substance use disorder. This is used broadly with clients who need improved coping skills. They don't have to meet criteria for PTSD and substance abuse, as the skills can be generalized. The third protocol that we used is Helping Men Recover, and we actually were fortunate enough with the grant money to have Dan Griffiths come and do training in our courthouse for our providers and case managers. There's now also Helping Women Recover as well. That's a different methodology, but pretty much based upon a similar syllabus. Helping Men Recover integrates the theory of addiction, a theory of trauma, and a theory of male psychosocial development. The program materials consist of a facilitator manual and a participant workbook. Here there are 18 sessions that are done in 4 modules, the first one focusing on self, the second on relationships, the third on sexuality, and the fourth on spirituality. It's really interesting to see different men in my court talk about their experiences in helping men recover. And it's interesting that my younger participants in their 20s enjoy it just as much as my older participants, especially some of my older veterans who are in their 60s and early 70s. So it really is universal in application, and people do really benefit from the different groups. Some people have asked me in the past if we've ever sent people to multiple treatment interventions, and yes, we have. If we found that the first one didn't work, and we thought, if say they started with Helping Men Recover and that they really needed more work still in the trauma field, we may then send them to another program that does seeking safety as well. So they can be used in tandem. You don't just have to pick one. My participant feedback, like Alyssa's, was very, very similar. Trauma services saved my life. I'm very grateful for this experience. Though it's been difficult at times, I know it will be better, my life and my future. And last, I know I have a couple minutes, but I just want to wrap up with, I found this great piece on resilience. And there are 10 factors of resiliency. And I know Alyssa mentioned resilience as well, so I'd just like to go over what resilience is comprised of. The 10 factors include 1, being optimism and maintaining a positive attitude while being aware of the challenges that you face. I always try that in my courtroom to leave, even if somebody had a horrific update, I want to leave on a positive note. I want to say something that's going to bring them back to court next time. You know, I'll say something like, boy, you know, I know you had a real bad week. I'm hoping next week will be better, and I really look forward to getting a good update when you come back next week. 2, flexibility, which we did talk about earlier. 3, a core value system, staying true to your strong personal morals and beliefs. Sometimes we see people in our part go back to their church. That's a very common theme when you ask what's going on in their lives, what's new. People say, you know, I went back to church. I haven't done that in 20 years, but I really find it comforting. Faith, both dependent and independent of religion. 5, finding those positive role models for your participants, them finding people in their lives that they can lean upon and look up to. 6, social support, a safety net for support and communication. 7, physical fitness. I know that people are starting to heal and get better when they tell me that they went to the gym, or they went and joined the YMCA, or they started to take the free yoga class at the library. This shows me that they're willing to go out there and start doing some other healthy activity that can be a release for them and a good stress buster, and hopefully help them manage some of those symptoms from past trauma. 8 is cognitive strength. 9 is facing fears we know that fear is normal and can be used as a guide in overcoming life's challenges, but the key there is to facing the fear, crossing the bridge, and moving forward. And 10 is finding meaning in struggles. So thank you. I know now we do have about 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Judge Hirsch, and thank you to Alyssa. So we're going to open it up to questions. We have the question and answer box, and we're also going to open up all of the lines if you have questions. So just to begin with, there was a question that was asked previously in the question and answer box, and I think I'll direct this question at Judge Hirsch, and then Alyssa might also have a follow-up response to it. But what is the screening tools that you use?
Okay. For trauma specifically, we use the ACE first. We like that the best, adverse childhood experiences, but then also we do use the Trauma Symptom Checklist 40, TSC 40. We find that the results from that are also helpful. We also learned a while ago that you cannot just give people the form and ask them to fill it out, because a lot of people can't read and understand some of the words in the form. So we'll actually have someone ask them the questions. And then we do use the PTSD checklist, the civilian version.
Alyssa, I don't know if you had other tools that you wanted to add that you found to be successful.
Yes, I'm going to put in the box. I hope this works right now. It's a bit dated, but there's a link from the NIC website. It's annotated bibliography and includes a list of several screening and assessments for trauma, and also specifies which ones are gender responsive. So that's, and I'm just trying to, I'll figure out how to post this before we get off, but it's very useful in terms of reading through what the different tools are, many of which Judge Hirsch described. And I just want to, reiterate what Judge Hirsch said about the way in which you decide to do trauma assessment really matters, when you do it, and to not rush into that type of a process, because it can be so dysregulating and triggering. And then even when you do feel that someone is ready to move through an assessment, to make it as supportive as possible, including things like putting in place supports for him or her should they leave the treatment program or the courtroom and experience symptoms that are linked to having completed the assessment, be it dreams, just an agitation, guilt about answering some of the questions honestly. So again, make sure folks are fully supported while they're completing it, but also in the hours, days, and weeks after, ensure they have access to hotlines and numbers and providers that can provide support if they're feeling unglued in any way.
Thank you so much for that follow-up. So we have opened the line, so if anyone has any questions, you can feel free. You should be, as long as you're not muted on your end, we should be able to hear you, because that's sometimes an issue. Or you can also still put it in the chat box and we'll be able to respond.
Okay, I think I got that link there that gives some information on some of the tools we mentioned and others.
Oh, thanks, Alyssa. So I'm curious, Alyssa, from your perspective, so Judge Hirsch talked about a couple of evidence-based practices that are focused on trauma. Are there other specific evidence-based practices or promising practices that you also wanted to mention that as possibilities for people to consider?
That is, yes, there are so many even emerging models now that are being used by the field, a lot of group models. Some of them are, so there's certainly the list of trauma-informed curricula, a few of which Judge Hirsch described. And there's another link that I can provide where the Resource Center provides a list of what the models are currently that are the most popular in terms of addressing trauma. There's also some on the SAMHSA website. There's a great list. So we can provide those lists as well. And I did want to add that there are some models, for instance, moving on. There's a adult version and a juvenile version that, although not specifically focused on trauma, is delivered in a trauma-informed manner, and it focuses on skill building. So it's more of a gender-responsive approach to a cognitive behavioral intervention. A lot of the cognitive behavioral interventions, traditional ones, kind of the older ones from years past that are still in use are not always trauma or gender or culturally responsive. So just to be very mindful of even the programs that you're running or referring clients to, that may not even be, the purpose may not be to provide trauma treatment or support, but those programs may or may not be trauma informed. So to make sure that you're investigating that, and certainly any of us can be supports in helping you access the latest literature on outcomes, particularly with specific populations like trauma survivors, women versus men, veterans, et cetera. Because my kind of gentle warning is that I still see groups being facilitated in various aspects of corrections that are actively triggering, shaming clients, moving into cognitive behavioral interventions when clients are actively dysregulated, or not including a group process, things like mandatory disclosure, for instance. So I've seen group models where clients have to stand up and say what their charge and their presenting issues are in front of the group, and things like that are actually really counterproductive to creating safety in trauma-informed environment. So to not only be thinking of what are the trauma-informed models and approaches one-on-one and group-wise, but what's the other work that we're doing, and is that also trauma-informed in the content, but also the delivery methods?
Thank you. So I think that kind of touched a little bit on another question that we had from the group, which was just what can you do with individual treatment, or what individual treatment theories are around there rather than the group treatment, which I think we have a lot of examples of that. So as an individual or as a counselor, what strategies are there?
One of the models that I strongly encourage folks to consider, both for individual but also group interventions, it's called somatic experiencing. It's developed by Peter Levine, and it's an approach to trauma recovery that is designed to bring into the treatment space what we now understand to be happening in the body as a result of trauma. So it's not a talk therapy approach, but rather helps survivors to build stability in the here and now as they're actively dealing with trauma symptoms. And what's wonderful is that there are tons of online introductory trainings you can access even for free from the Somatic Experiencing Training Institute. And as clinicians and even non-clinicians, you can integrate somatic experiencing principles into the work that you're already doing and the philosophy that you already have as a clinician or as a corrections professional. I think probation and parole officers would benefit greatly from understanding the basics of somatic experiencing. And it's where, when I presented the 3 R's earlier, those interventions are based on the principles of somatic experiencing and how we can stay regulated ourselves as professionals when we're doing the work, recognizing what's going on in our own bodies when our heart starts to race and we feel the heat in the back of our neck when a client speaks to us in a certain way, et cetera. So, Sarah, what I can do is some of the reviews of the group curricula, the link to somatic experiencing, I can provide that to you, and perhaps you could email it to folks and provide it with the recording so that they can access those as supports as they're investigating next steps.
That sounds perfect. Thanks so much, Alyssa. You know, with that, we actually are just at our time marker here, so keeping directly to the time. So we have the contact information if you have any follow-up questions for Alyssa Benedict or Judge Marcia Hirsch. And we also have a link to our partner for this, the National Resource Center on Justice Involved Women. They have a lot of good resources in dealing with this in a gender-responsive way as well. And then here is my contact information in case you have any questions, and a link to our website for the courts page. But if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to email any of us, and we can figure out who should be answering that and route it to each other. But we did record this, and we will post this as well, so it'll be available for your teams too. Thank you so much for joining the webinar, and have a great day.
Thank you.